Disability advocates have been involved in civic engagement for years, but has it really been effective?
In this podcast series, we will talk about disability and public engagement, examine the municipal disability advisory committees as a case study for this engagement, and discuss what we can do to move the needle forward to create positive change.
Welcome to Our Voices.
Disability through a lens of public engagement.
I'm Anu Pala.
And I'm Alfiya Barilova.
Welcome back to Our Voices. In this episode, we speak with community advocate and councillor for the City of North Vancouver, Tony Valente, and artist, actor, and disability advocate Amy Amantea about their advocacy work in the disability community and their thoughts on creating barrier-free communities. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks, Anu.
So let's start off by talking a little bit about how you both got involved in Alfiya's research.
Alfiya and I have known each other for many years. We met through a theater company called Real Wheels Theater, which is a integrated theater company, disability and allies, that I'm on the board of, and still president of the board of that particular theater company. And Alfiya and I were board members. And so through, I guess, my work there, Alfiya and I got to know each other. And she learned that I was a member of the North Shore Advisory Committee on Disability Issues. And I'd been a member of that committee for many, many years. I just retired last year from that committee after about 10 years at least. I actually received, I'm going to just toot my own horn, I received the Mayor's Award through the District of North Vancouver for my my years of volunteer leadership on that committee. So I served as chair of that committee for almost that full 10 years. And that committee really is a lot about the three municipalities of the North Shore. So that's the District of West Vancouver, the District of North Vancouver, and the City of North Vancouver, looking at accessibility in terms of built environment, streetscapes, sometimes can be multifamily dwellings like apartments and things like that. But each municipality kind of has some of their own structures in place. And so this committee of people with disabilities is comprised of members from each of the three municipalities. And we work with mayor and council and city staff to work on projects that they bring us to help increase accessibility for folks that live in our community. So that's kind of how I got involved in the project, which was, I sit on one of these committees and do a lot of work in accessibility throughout the Metro Vancouver area in general. So that's kind of how I got involved. Tony, how about you?
Well, I think, and also Amy, kind of goes back to how I met you the first time, which I seem to recall was through something that had been presented to that committee. I was not elected then. I was actually the chair of Hub Cycling on the North Shore, so trying to promote safer streets. And I remember having a lot of conversations with Amy about a new project that was being built. It was the Mountain Highway overpass, and what interactions look like there on the sidewalk, on the street, with multi-use pathways and some infrastructure for bikes. So I actually really appreciated working with Amy to kind of understand the perspective from the ACDI committee and ensuring that we were considering kind of all users when trying to deal with street safety. So I think that was kind of the lead into my exposure to working on kind of municipal accessibility issues, even though I wasn't really elected. And then, I think we were about to talk about it. From my experience being on council, a lot of what goes on council and what councillors bring to council is also from their personal lived experience. And so I personally don't have lived experience with accessibility, but the thing that I do have is I have a niece who is blind, and she helps me understand a lot more about not having vision and what that's like for her. And then the other piece that has been so important for me has been actually reaching out to people who are members of ACDI, people who are not members of ACDI, but that are living with different experiences, and actually spending time with them to meet them on the street, understand, for example, I have some contacts that, their mobility device is obviously the way they get around. And then they're showing me on our sidewalks where some of the sidewalk misalignments are actually causing them trouble and can be a threat to them getting around the city. So it's been for me a lot about listening and trying to bring that knowledge. And I think that's, Amy, what you're saying about ACDI, that's a lot about what ACDI is about too, right? It's bringing those perspectives and formalizing it in a process so that all municipalities on the North Shore can benefit from the experiences of others and try to make things a little bit better.
Yeah, it aligns with nothing about us without us, right? in terms
Yeah.
of what you're saying, Tony, about listening to folks, understanding what lived experience looks like, what our barriers are in the community, because we all just want to be included and to live our lives as barrier free as possible. And that takes work, that takes partnership, that takes listening, and that takes valuing what lived experience looks like.
Thank you, Amy and Tony, for sharing that and sharing your connections to the ACDI. What's the role of the council in getting involved in being connected to committees like this and having a real understanding of some of the accessibility issues? I guess maybe Tony, you can start with that.
Sure. I mean, I think it's critical. Like I said, it does go back to bringing that perspective. Ideally, we would have people on council who have some of this perspective, but given that we don't always, we benefit greatly from having these committees actually give us a bit more understanding. And I think there's a big shift right now just in terms of the world we want to see. I don't know if it's like a post-pandemic thing. I would like to think, we've taken some things out of the pandemic where we're going to really make things better. But I think even the focus now on accessibility that we're seeing from legislative changes from the province, I think people really have opened their minds to what needs to be done to make things accessible and also trying to find more equity for people. So if I think about like what is the municipal role, I mean, the municipality has a lot of power in terms of what our streets look like, what our recreation centers and libraries look like. And so everywhere that there's contact with people, I will go back always to the street, sidewalks. It is just so critical that we have those perspectives in place.
Yeah, I guess I would just highlight that the relationship is really important. And certainly there are kind of protocols in place. So the ACDI in particular is we have a representative from council from each of the 3 municipalities that sits on the committee. They don't have any voting rights per se, but they bring things that are coming from the council perspective to our table, because so for example, I live in the district of North Vancouver. So I may not be watching on my television or be in council chambers to know all of the things that are coming up, for example, at the table of the city council. And so, a city councilor might come to our committee and say, well, these are the things that are coming up in the city in terms of what's related to accessibility. So maybe we're talking about, like Tony says, a new set of sidewalks that are going in, or what furniture might look like on our sidewalks, a number of things, right? And so helping to come to us with these types of things and say, we need some perspective on XYZ. Like, this is how the importance of the relationship works. When I was sitting on the committee, we were working a lot with councillors and with city staff on trying to develop a bit of a white paper, so to speak, on like, can we put together like a wish list of what, for example, accessible bathrooms would look like in park spaces, and share that with the 3 municipalities, so that every time they were building park spaces that had bathrooms, they didn't have to come to us and say, now look at this one and look at this one and look at this one. We just had kind of this wish list put together that was like, well, as you're designing these buildings for public bathrooms, these are the things we want you to consider. Because there's BC building code, but from the perspective of these accessibility committees and maybe beyond, BC building code is like the lowest rung on the ladder in terms of accessibility. My personal small business that I opened early on around accessibility consultation was called Access in Practice, because really it was about the end user, and not just the end user, but disability kind of has its own spectrum. So if you're a wheelchair user and you have full dexterity to reach your arms to the taps, that's great. But what if you don't? What if your mobility is you don't have the ability to reach that far? So how are we designing our spaces so that the person with the least amount of independence can access it, right? So building code is great in theory, but for me, it feels like the lowest rung on the ladder. And that's where the lived experience comes in. And so if we can start to say, great, like, let's up the building code by having these conversations, then that's where we need to go.
I agree. And I think that's one of the things where it's so much better to get people with lived experience on the table to have those conversations. So you're not going back and trying to fix something. Rather, you're starting from scratch and doing it right from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
It's so true. And in addition to like my city council role, like I also work in project management, and I just feel like it's just good project management. Know who your users are, understand their needs, and really plan for the future so you're not making changes, because that's also from a delivering these projects perspective, that's how you make things more affordable in terms of actually getting the work done to build them.
The ACDI would take a project, for example, that would be brought to us from, let's say, city staff, and we would, have a a conversation with city staff, perhaps a developer or whoever was contracted to help staff to design whatever it is we're looking at. So let's say it's a street plan or whatever it is, because there could be multiple different projects, right? We would give them a report back on all of our findings of accessibility, all of our recommendations, and those would go back through staff. And eventually it comes to the council table because council has to vote on these projects, right? And so that information goes back to council, and you need council to vote in favor of these things. And so, we put the recommendations on the table, and we need council to champion and say, the ACDI has said this, and we support the ACDI in their recommendations. And sometimes the truth is on these advisory committees, that is exactly what we are. We give the utopian wish list, and sometimes all of those things don't make the cut, truly. But there are a lot of great folks on council that are really championing the highest bar of accessibility. Some of the things that I think about are barrier-free balconies in apartment buildings, whether they're market for sale buildings or whether they're rental buildings. And forever and a day, the ACDI and probably other committees have been told, oh, we can't do that because, it jeopardizes the envelope of the building, and it can be a leak, water can leak. And it's like, well, we all know that it can happen. It does cost more money, of course. And I remember sitting at the table at a meeting with somebody who was a developer. We were in West Vancouver, in the district of West Vancouver. And one of these developers said to me, in $4 million, we were selling $4 million condos, 2 balconies, and they had a barrier, right? Like the size of a curb cut, right? To step over onto the balcony. And he said to me, well, what if we made one of those balconies accessible? And I went, one? Like, if you could do one, you can do both, right? Why offer one? And right. And so I said to him, well, the Porsche that you came in today, what if we just made the passenger door? Oh, like, what if you could only get into your car from the passenger door? I mean, come on, right? So at the end of the day, there's a level of common sense, but, we provide these utopian wish lists, and sometimes we don't get barrier-free balconies, right? Even though we all know that for livability, aging in place, for visitability, that's the highest bar of accessibility, but we just don't always get that. But there are some folks that really champion in that, but it always comes down to a vote.
Yeah, and when I interviewed you for the research project, it really resonated with me when you talked about all the reports that ACDI is submitting and sharing with the staff, because not a lot of committees do that. And I thought it's a great way also to increase accountability. And I understand it's just a wish list sometimes, but still many times people with disabilities share the feedback, but they don't know what happens with the feedback. And so I think that's one of the frustrations that I heard from some people when they work on these committees.
Early in my career on the ACDI, staff members of municipalities were taking the notes, right? So we would share our wish list of recommendations. They would take the notes, and then projects would be built, and we'd go, wait a second, that's not what I said. You didn't interpret that correctly. And I started to say, wait a second, I have to put this down in my words, because somehow it's not getting translated correctly. And I don't have any kind of paper trail to be able to say, no, that's not how I worded that, or that's not what I meant. So we didn't have any place to go back and say, there was a report that referenced this, but you did Y instead of X. And why did you do that? Right? Because they would just say, well, we got a note that said X, but no, you didn't. You did Y. So I started doing these reports, and for years it was just me doing reports because we were instituting a new thing. And if the ACDI was doing one project a week, that would be great. The ACDI was meeting once a month at that time, and in the recent years, we are meeting weekly and doing maybe 3 or 4 meetings a week. So that's a lot of report writing, because it probably takes on average 2 to 3 hours to write a report, and you put in photos and you put in a whole bunch of things to kind of support your, this is the kind of latch we need on doors, and these are the kinds of toilets with the kinds of accessible flushes that you can have, and right, like very detailed things, so that folks can look at that and say, oh, I get it. I understand what they're trying to relay in terms of the details.
Yeah, and probably also thinking about accessibility, not just from a checklist perspective, but really, like you said, yes, maybe having BC Building Code in mind, but also kind of going beyond that as well, and providing deeper and much more nuanced recommendations.
How much of those recommendations do you think are really being implemented, put into practice?
I feel like in more recent years, it has been a lot better, and I'll say that like, so where do I come from when I say that? I'm thinking about the new Harry Jerome. So we're
Mm,
building a new recreation center in the city of North Vancouver. It's a $200 million plus project. And I would say that our staff have been told that the whole focus is on accessibility. For example, the project is going to be certified by the Rick Hansen Foundation. And I know sometimes we've had people in the public say to us, oh, well, that's just for people that have a disability where they're in the wheelchair. And that's really not been the intent. Like we've been trying to address all elements. So whether people have a visual impairment, we have gone to great extent, and we'll see when it opens if we've been successful. But it has been a driving principle for that project. And I also I was looking at some things, thinking about this podcast, specifically the North Van Recreation Commission. We have some bylaw stuff coming for how we work with the commission. And I wanted to read kind of this piece because it's kind of starting to build in the accessibility focus into all of the work that we do. So on the Rec Commission, its mandate includes plan, develop, evaluate, and jointly and seamlessly deliver with the approved funding, etc., for the year. Recreation services and art services in the district and city of North Vancouver to meet the needs of district and city residents, regardless of age, regardless of ability, gender, or economic status. So we are starting to really, I think, shift the focus in terms of like what we're doing as a city to support people. And I know sometimes it's hard to see that on the ground, especially when you're an advocate. And I say that because I've been an advocate, again, more on like street safety side, but it is sometimes hard to see the change. But I do feel like within the structures of the institutions, by baking these things into the guiding principles, like literally the mandate, we're starting to see a shift. I don't know, Amy. I hope you feel a little bit of the shift, but I do know as an
yeah.
advocate it can be hard sometimes.
I would say like the reality of it when you live with the disability is these things will never happen fast enough, right? Like that's just the reality of it. Like I give props because my whole philosophy when I do consultation in my work around accessibility strategies is I don't expect people to go from 0 to 100 overnight. I'm looking for purposeful, meaningful. That's the bold underlined word, meaningful steps forward, right? That's what feels important to me. And I think policy is also really important. But all the buzz terms that I use in my teaching, access begins with A. We talk about it at the very beginning of everything, right? Access is good for everyone. So it's not just about people with disabilities. Access is good for everybody. And so I think that what you're talking about, Tony, in terms of baking it into mandates and policies and principles is absolutely what needs to happen. And second to that, like built environment obviously is important, making sure our structures are accessible. But how do we now look also at making our programs accessible? Where's the social accessibility in these things, right? So if I
Yeah.
come into the rec center and it's great that I can access, say, a pottery class because they have lowered sinks or, some of those things built in, how now do the instructors work with me on a level that is dignified as somebody with an accessibility? How do they speak to me in a dignified way? How do they translate or adapt their teaching methods to somebody who's blind or partially sighted? All of those pieces. How do we institute those things? Because for me, there's access and inclusion. And those two things they're different. They're married,
Yeah.
they're in a relationship, but access is about, for me, access is like, can I get into the space? And inclusion is about who talks to me and how do I feel when I'm in that space?
Participate in dignity.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Access plus inclusion equals equity.
Yeah, there's a famous for me phrase that kind of goes along the lines, you can't legislate morality. Like you can
Yeah.
certainly put in place certain standards, but yeah, when it comes to social accessibility, like you said, Amy, it's not as easy. So maybe a question for you, Tony. Like you mentioned some of the principles that will be underlying the work of different departments in municipalities. Like, what do you think are some of the institutional challenges that might prevent or might be kind of a barrier to a meaningful engagement? Do you anticipate any of the challenges, or maybe you can kind of point them out right now? Some of those challenges.
I mean, I think most people in their minds want to do the right thing, and there's like no doubt for me that these are the right things to be doing. So I don't think that there's like barrier in, in the documentation. Actually, I would say, you know, uh, also from a policy perspective, just thinking about some of the questions that you sent over before this podcast, around the Accessible BC Act,
Hmm.
like if anything, I would say it's the opposite now. Like we are being pushed to do this, but I think what Amy's point there about the inclusion is, if there's building the structures and that's good, but then how do I feel? Like how would a person feel in those situations? So I think that's the part that we need to work on. And I think, even with ACDI, we need to continually be seeking out engagement with the community in terms of how they feel about the things that we're building, the programs we're delivering as well. There is a further push that we need to get to. And like I think there's a lot of desire to get there. One of the things that I think about as well, just for example, so we have the Accessible BC Act, which is great, but currently under the Motor Vehicle Act, a person with a wheelchair technically cannot choose to use the bike lane because I believe that under the Motor Vehicle Act currently, they are considered a pedestrian. Now, nobody says anything, and it's not a problem, but we're building a lot of infrastructure to support mobility. And I think that what I've seen in other countries, and I've made a few visits to the Netherlands last year, is their like bike lanes, which is what we would traditionally call them, but maybe more mobility infrastructure is the better way to call it, actually support people getting around. And I've done a fair bit of reading. There's a great book by the Frontlets. They're a couple that were here in Vancouver. They were cycling advocates, but a whole chapter in their book is dedicated to accessibility and how actually building good cycling infrastructure can actually serve people with disabilities in terms of how they get around. And I'm seeing it on the street in North Van where we've done the infrastructure. We need to go further. That is actually serving people with their chairs, and then sometimes they have like these adapted. It's like so the chair has like four wheels, but then they have this kind of electric attachment that goes onto the front. And so
Hmm.
this can be huge in terms of enabling them to get around on their own, getting to transit if they don't live directly near the transit station. Like that is life changing for folks. And I think there's a lot of reasons why we are not building enough of that infrastructure right now. And I think that's really the issue. It kind of goes back to what Amy said, like, yeah, we're making progress. That's great. But is it ever enough? Is it fast enough? And how do we actually continue to deliver and have a plan for that delivery?
You know,
Absolutely.
one of the things that I think about in terms of the question that you just asked, Tony, Alfiya, is obviously there's always going to be barriers. There's a system in place, right? And the system has served a certain demographic, in this case, able-bodied people, for a very long time. We live in an ableist society. That's the reality. As a blind person, we live in a sight-centric world. Everything's based on what you can see, and we're starting to see change in these places, which is a great thing. Like having advisory committees is great. These are volunteer committees. Having paid opportunities within municipalities that meet somebody with a disability at where they're at. So if I am not a person who can work 40 hours a week, that's a thing we have to consider, right? If I'm somebody who has a personal support worker and I can't show up at 8 a.m. because my personal support worker is not going to come in at 7, right? Like, this is the idea of crip time, right? How can we
Right.
customize positions so that folks with disabilities can come into our spaces, be paid to do this work, and be paid to have their voices heard at the municipal level, right? Like it's one thing to have a committee of volunteer voices, but it's another thing to be able to support folks at a paid level. Back in the day when I spent a lot of time on the ACDI. I actually think it was more like 12 years, only there's like 10 years documented, but I think it was more like 12 years when I do my own math. Thinking I was spending like 40 hours a week doing work with the ACDI. I was doing full-time hours with all the work that I was doing. And I loved it. I very much enjoyed it. And I thought at some point somebody's going to say, "Hey, you know what? I'm going to give you a job." And I was like waiting for that moment. And then I would go on the website, the municipal websites, and try and look for jobs, which I had no qualifications for, because the barrier to accessing education and opportunities to be in any of these positions was like not something that anybody with a disability was going to probably get to do. So where do we meet folks? Where do we find opportunities for folks and bring them in and say, "Hey, what you offer is of value, and we'd like to pay you to bring that into our communities."
To
I
lend
think
your
that that's
voice.
important. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that is part of the piece with the Accessible BC Act is to to pay people with lived experience for their expertise, because what you're saying really does resonate with me as well in terms of the number of hours I have spent on various committees because I'm passionate about the topic of accessibility, and I'm thinking that, okay, this is going to lead to a job down the road. Yes, of course we build skills along the way, but I think traditionally what has happened is that as people with disabilities have just been expected to lend our voices on a volunteer level, when now I think slowly it's more than recommended that we all bring value
Yeah.
to the table, and we need to be accommodated for that.
Absolutely. We all have rent to pay. We have bills to pay.
We all need to eat. That's what I
Yep.
always say.
Yep.
We all need to eat.
Yep.
Vancouver's not a cheap place to live.
Absolutely.
So I have a question. So the Accessible BC Act is still in its early implementation. What are your hopes for this legislation, and does it have potential to improve how municipalities think about accessibility?
I think it definitely has the potential to improve how we think about accessibility. I mean, the simple fact that like there's legislation out there sends a really important signal, I think, to everyone in the province. So that is great. I think the other thing that we need to think about, kind of maybe two things, is so the North Shore has had ACDI, so the Advisory Committee on Disability Issues, and I think it's been around, I understand, Amy, since 1991. Does that sound about
Oh
right?
yeah, it's been around a long time for sure. Yeah.
That was a good starting point then. And like, how do we take that and move that forward? One of the things I would be curious about as well is, we have other committees in the city. This is just my personal opinion,
Hmm.
but I think it would be really beneficial to have a person with a disability, whatever that is, almost like embedded in those other committees, because I think there would be a huge benefit to the people that are on those municipal committees to actually hear. And again, like we'd have to look at the piece around honorariums, et cetera, but to benefit from that perspective, because it is valuable. And I think what does happen or can happen with ACI is they're providing valuable feedback that's going to staff. There's also an opportunity for people in the greater community that maybe don't have lived experience to understand a little bit of someone else's perspective. I mean, you think about community, like being able to understand else's perspective is really critical. And then the second thing I want to raise, and I don't want to take up all the time, but is in the city of North Vancouver, we are working on a community well-being strategy. And this is intended to be a strategy where we'll be focused on like social, economic, environmental, health, cultural, and like political conditions to help people flourish and fulfill their potential. And that obviously sounds like a lot. So what does that actually mean? Basically, this plan focuses in kind of six areas. It talks about complete communities, so enabling people to get around. It talks about a city for all ages, so trying to make sure that we've got plans for well-being for people in all age groups. It has a huge focus on housing, which of course is very challenging for people on the North Shore in general, but I would say is especially challenging for people with disabilities because of, the requirements they have, and then also just like, affordability is a massive issue. And then the next three parts are really focused on inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And so how we create an inclusive city and what this looks like, this kind of gets into like, really all areas again. And then an inclusive economy and poverty, focusing on poverty reduction. And then the advocacy side and creating partnerships and seeking financial supports from also other levels of government and our nonprofit sector. So it's a pretty broad plan, and it's been out for public comment for some time. And I'm looking forward to coming back to council. And I think it's going to help us maybe start to define the next step of where we go with promoting accessibility. I will also say there's been quite a bit of discussion in the community about this plan and whether it's trying to meet some of the requirements of the Accessible BC Act. And I think that's a discussion that's continuing to go on, but definitely a part of the city's approach to how we're helping people get a step up.
Tony, is this supposed to be an accessibility plan, or is it a replacement for accessibility plan, or accessibility plan is going to be developed separately?
Well, I think that's a really great question. So what we've definitely heard from the community that they're looking for accessibility plan, like a separate plan. I think we've certainly addressed it within this plan, but I'm not sure that that actually meets what some folks in the community are looking for. So I
Okay.
think there's an ongoing discussion about that, and there there's folks have come to speak to us at council, and I know that that's that is definitely ongoing. What we've said in the city is that we have tried to break accessibility into all of our strategies, and we've had a number of really important strategies come out over the last few years, and some are continuing to come out. One of them being our mobility strategy. However, having said that, like I think if it's not clear for folks, then we will need to make it clear for people. That's my opinion. I think in some cases people were looking at the draft plan here and not necessarily seeing that come through.
Okay.
My hopes and dreams are, I'm going to keep them realistic because we don't have standards or regulations in place yet, right? So I hope to see some consistency around specific things in accessibility. Like even if I just look on the North Shore, if I want an APS unit, so an accessible pedestrian signal, those will look different in each municipality. So if we've got 44 municipalities in the greater Vancouver area, right? So if I go from Burnaby to New West to North Van to whatever, they'll all be a little bit different. So where's the consistency in something like that? I would love to see some consistency. So maybe the plan can help with some of that. I think also some of this is going to depend on what kind of teeth that the plan has in terms of what happens when accessibility isn't met. How long does perhaps a business or an institution or whatever have to meet accessibility standards, and what happens if they don't meet those standards? If you have 2 steps up to your front entrance of your establishment and you have to put in a ramp or you have to change some infrastructure, what is that timeline? And if you miss that timeline, what is the penalty for that? Is there a penalty for that? What happens if a guide dog user is refused entry to a restaurant or to a taxi cab, which is already law, that's against the law, but it happens all the time, right? And we have no recourse for that. It's not like you can call the police and say, I've been refused by a taxi cab. We have no way of being able to say, hey, I've been wronged here. What can I do about that? So what did the teeth look like? Those are some of the things that I think about. And one of the things that I hope doesn't happen, I guess, with the Accessible BC Act is I don't want it to become a rubber stamp. I don't want it to take away the human thinking capacity around accessibility. And I think about this a lot with tactile walking surface indicators. So folks that don't know what those are, they're the yellow strip that lines the SkyTrain stations, or we might see them on sidewalks. And, they can be quite controversial in terms of, when we use them and how we use them. And are they a conflicting access need between blind folks and wheelchair using folks and other folks with disabilities? Absolutely, all of that exists. And if, for example, and I don't know that this would happen, but if, for example, the Accessible BC Act said there should be a tactile walking surface indicator at every letdown so that blind people know how to cross the street, and you just rubber stamped that in and put them at every letdown, that could actually cause more barriers than it does cause access points. Because you need to think about what the intersection looks like. Are there other cues for crossing that street, perhaps? Do we have a significant grade there, especially on the North Shore, but we have topography that sometimes can be 8 or 10% that a wheelchair user has to navigate. And if there's a tactile paver there, especially if you're in a manual chair with small casters, that could be really dangerous going into a street. So what are the other cues in the environment that a cane user or a guide dog user might be able to use in terms of orientation and mobility to cross the street? So I'm a little bit wary of this idea of just like the checklist that you mentioned earlier, Alfiya, that takes away the thought process, the human element of what's best for this scenario, what's best for this community, and having community lend their voice to that specific thing. Because if we have legislation, sometimes we say, well, the voice of the community is already spoken, so we don't need to ask them anymore.
Absolutely.
Those are the things I don't want to happen.
Yeah, and you brought up a couple of points that I'd like to comment on. So as someone who does performance and performance evaluation, I certainly agree that evaluation component absolutely should be part of the accessibility plans. The question then becomes, how do we actually define success in those situations? What success looks like? But I think it's something that's important to think about now, not later, because evaluation often happens after the fact, which is actually not the right way to do it. And then, of course, your point about competing access needs, something that's been on my mind as well. How do you navigate that? What works for one individual might not work for another individual. And maybe something you talked about, Tony, too, about the just maybe different stakeholders. And I think the idea of aligning interests of different stakeholders. I'm thinking the example of bike lane, for example, right? So the bike users, wheelchair users, how do we kind of talk about that? How do we bring them together? Because sometimes there are conflicts there, right? So
Absolutely.
yeah.
I mean, I think on that particular piece, I feel like I'm still working on that.
Mhm.
I was the chair of upcycling. I don't remember Amy, like I don't know, maybe you remember better, but like how did we get in touch? Because I I remember phoning you, but I don't know like kind of what led to that. Like I'm obviously happy that I did, but like you remember like how we got in touch
I,
about that
oh,
project?
I yeah, I don't know. I know Hub had reached out to me at one point about snowfall, actually, but I don't know if that was you, Tony, or if that was somebody else from Hub. But like,
I
when
think that was I think that was Martin. I think
I
he
think it might have been Martin. Yeah.
So yeah, I
But
mean, well, that's another great example, right? Like a lot of the snowfall clearing in a lot of cities is very focused on motor vehicles, and I
Mhm.
would say is totally focused then on generally able-bodied people
Mhm.
being able to get around. And we know that, as a generalization, like people with disabilities tend to depend more on public transit. So ensuring they have a clear walkway to get to public transit is absolutely critical. That's another area where we need to kind of focus on sidewalk clearing. And I know there's been a lot of work in the district of North Vancouver to ensure like homeowners are clearing in front of their places as required by the bylaw and actually doing that so that people have access to public transit. At the end of the day, like all of this stuff really comes back to listening and understanding and taking the time to do that. Given like the focus on equity, there are a number of studies coming out now, and I think there is an understanding that if we want to do things right, like we do need to work together and we do need to find those compromises. I think that's what Amy and I were kind of
mhm.
testing out, all those years ago and actually setting a kind of a foundation for. And I think that's what needs to continue to do this. And yeah, we can write a lot of great plans and a lot of great legislation, but if it doesn't help people actually get access and that inclusion, it's kind of all for nothing.
Mhm.
So I think there's a lot more discussions to be had, and I actually should say as well, I was recently invited as a counselor to the CEO of TransLink, brought together a group around mobility and accessibility, and we had people there from the accessibility community, and they were there with people talking about bike lanes. So
Mhm.
there's clearly an understanding that that's happening, and it's all about TransLink's 2050 plan and what that rolls out and what that looks like. And to Amy's point, if we're going to build things for people to roll in or walk in, it needs to feel consistent. And the bus stops need to be consistent so that people can get around. And I think that's where TransLink has started to realize that. And I think they're starting to move that forward. And certainly at a municipal level, from a bus stop perspective, I can say that I think we have something like 97 or 98% of our bus stops now are considered fully accessible, which is quite challenging actually, given some of the geography that we have with like, really steep hills, but I think we're about there and I think we're working on the rest of them.
Great. And I'm actually part of the study right now, looking at the experiences of wheelchair users who do use bike lanes in the city of Vancouver. So I'm
Oh,
happy to
excellent.
share. I'm happy to share some of the findings with you.
Yeah, I would appreciate that because I think that Motor Vehicle Act, the way it's set up right now, is actually setting us up for more of a divisive discussion rather than
Right.
a discussion that is about how do we make these things better.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been an incredibly rich discussion. I just feel like I can sit here and listen to you all day. On behalf of Alfiya and myself, we really want to thank you, Tony and Amy, for sharing your passion and your expertise. We just really, really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Thank
Um,
you all for having us here. Like I really appreciated this, and thanks Amy for the introduction.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I can talk about accessibility all day long. It's what I do. There's no finish line in this work, friends. We just keep making purposeful, meaningful steps forward.
I just echo you, Anu, and really thank you both for your time. I agree, Amy. Like I can definitely keep talking about this. There's lots of work to be done, but I am very excited, and I'm very excited to have allies like you, Tony, to make this progress. Thank you again, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you again in the future.
Thank you. Proud to be one.
Yeah.
okay. You've been listening to Our Voices with Anu Pala and Dr. Alfiya Badalova.
This study was generously funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. We would like to thank our podcast guests, Amy Amantea, Tony Valente, and Karen Lai, and all the municipalities who participated in my research project.
Thank you for listening.